Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. In this video, we're going to continue to look at the preface to the Legacy Standard Bible. And we've looked at quite a few sections here. In this video, I want to look at the Hebrew and Greek language portions where it gets into the text and the way that they translate the original languages. So what I'm going to do is actually compare the Legacy Standard Bible preface, which is on the right, and on the left here, I'm going to have the preface to the New American Standard Bible 95 edition, which is what the Legacy Standard Bible is largely based off of and is revising. So I'm just going to have that there for comparison. And as you see here, the Hebrew text that the Legacy Standard Bible is using, it looks really similar to what they say in the NASB 95. It says the Legacy Standard Bible utilizes the latest edition of Rudolf Kittle's Biblia Hebraica together with the most recent light from lexicography, cognate languages, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so that's really what you're reading here in the NASB preface as well. When you get to the Hebrew tenses, though, section, as you're looking here at the comparison, you see that the LSB has a much longer section. I'll read that quickly here. It says, while recognizing the challenges of the Hebrew verbal system, the approach of the LSB has been guided by the Hebrew verb's form in light of its immediate and broad context. Thus, fundamentally, the LSB works to express distinctively the various verb forms. When appropriate, the translators have brought out various emphases of the verbal stems such as simple active, simple middle passive, factitive, causative, and iterative. The translation has also attempted to capture the complete, ongoing, habitual, inceptive, and resultative aspect of the verb. Finally, the translators took into account temporal adverbials and the syntactic constructions surrounding the verb to identify its tense. So that is talking about how they translate the Hebrew of the Old Testament, and as you can see, they get pretty technical there, even more detailed than what you saw in the NASB preface. So that shows you that the LSB really in many ways is geared towards students, people who are really studying the Word of God deeply and looking at the original languages. This preface is not just geared to what I would call a general audience. The preface is talking about things that probably the average Christian would get pretty confused by. And to be honest, I would have to look a lot of these things up to really clarify what they're saying here. So it's really interesting, but it shows that they are approaching this in a scholarly way. But I think in many ways very similar to what we read in the NASB. But looking at how they handle the Greek, I'll show you that quickly here between these two prefaces. And in the Legacy Standard Bible preface, it says that the Legacy Standard Bible has the benefit of a number of critical Greek texts in determining the best variant reading to translate. The 27th edition of Eberhard Nesle's New Testament Greek, supplemented by the 28th edition in the General Epistles, serve as the base text. On every variant reading, the Society of Biblical Literature GNT as well as the Tyndale House GNT were also consulted. In the end, each decision was based upon the current available manuscript evidence. Now, if you compare what they're saying here about the Greek text to the NASB, you can see that they are pretty much the same in their base text, although they're using the 27th edition here of Eberhard Nesle's New Testament. But they also added a section here where they're talking about variant readings and looking at the Society of Biblical Literature and Tyndale House Greek New Testament. So what that's saying is that they're really looking at the best evidence they can find and comparing all of it to make sure that we have the Greek text that most accurately reflects the original writings. Then when you get to Greek tenses here, I would say that these sections are largely similar between the LSB and the NASB. However, there are some changes that are made here, or even additions, and actually one of them is right here in the LSB. It says, in addition to aorist and imperfects, the translators have been sensitive to bring out in English the perfect tense, indicative, and participle as conveying a current state initiated in the past, one who has been born of God, see 1 John 5:1. And so the example that they're giving there, if you compare that to the New American Standard Bible in 1 John 5:1, that said, whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ, is born of God, and whoever loves the Father loves the child born of him. So in that verse, they are translating it as one who has been born of God. So that's a little bit different. I don't know how often you're going to see those differences between the NASB and the LSB, but that is one thing that they highlight there in the LSB preface. Also concerning questions. In the LSB it says, in the rendering of negative questions introduced by the participle may, which always expects the answer no, the LSB maintains the wording of the Greek text as opposed to adding a phrase at the end of the question. For example, he will not do this, will he? This allows for questions that truly have such phrasing to stand out, such as John 18:25. Readers are trusted to determine, given the context and the wording of the question, that a negative response is intended. Now, if you compare what's being said there to the NASB, it says in the NASB preface, in the rendering of negative questions introduced by the particle may, which always expects the answer no, the wording has been altered from a mere will he not do this to a more accurate he will not do this, will he? So it is interesting to me that the NASB says that what it is doing is more accurate, but it sounds to me like what the LSB translators are doing is a little bit more literal. The question that they're talking about there, the questions that they're referring to, do imply a negative response. They say in both prefaces the answer of those types of questions is always supposed to be no. But to make that clearer in the NASB, they would add a little phrase there at the end, whereas the LSB is not going to put that extra phrase in there for clarification. They're just going to trust the readers to understand the implied meaning of the question. I think it's neat to just quickly take a look at a question like this and compare it in a lot of different English translations, which I'm doing here at Bible Gateway. And it's a great website. I encourage you to utilize it. You can compare so many different translations here. And as you can see, the King James Version puts it this way, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. In the American Standard Version, which is really a parent to the New American Standard Bible, it says, art thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. So a little bit of a difference of phrasing there from the King James to the American Standard. They took out the word not in that question, but they did not add a phrase. When you get to the New American Standard Bible, it says, you are not one of his disciples as well, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. So as you can see in the New American Standard, they added a little phrase there, are you, just to clarify the intended meaning of that question. And a lot of the translations that I'm looking at add that little phrase there at the end of the question. One rendering that I think is interesting here, though, that doesn't have the extra phrase, is the Revised Standard Version, which says, are not you also one of his disciples? So the Revised Standard Version is interesting. It sounds like that's pretty literal there, but that's not typically how people ask questions in English. Are not you also one of his disciples? So that's interesting. And a couple of translations here say something like this, the Modern English Version, are you not also one of his disciples? That to me sounds a little bit more like we would ask the question if we weren't to put that extra phrase in there. Anyway, that is a look at the LSB preface talking about the Hebrew and Greek texts and how they are handling those texts in translation. I hope that this was interesting and helpful to you. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this in the comments below. I do like to talk about Bible translation as one of the topics on my channel. And I know people have a lot of interesting and sometimes very strong opinions about the subject, but this is a translation that people are really interested in, and a lot of people are looking forward to it, especially if they are fans of the New American Standard Bible and they want something that is a lot more on the literal side of Bible translation. But thank you so much for taking a look at this subject with me and listening to some of my thoughts from A Frisch Perspective.